Exorbitant banker bonuses are back in the headlines as the White House's paymaster Ken Feinberg cites 17 companies for doling out $1.6 billion in compensation in the 4 months after receiving government bailouts. That list includes big names like Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley. Hans Nichols had a chance to sit down with Feinberg this morning, and he joins us now live. Hans?
Guys, I asked Ken Feinberg to describe those pay packages in that 4-month period.
Their payment practices were either no criteria that we could discern, too much discretion, not actual benchmarks, excessive. We found that in many cases, individuals were getting double-digit compensation just during this window period. We basically examined each of the banks, each of these firms, and concluded that it was ill-advised to give this much money away with so little guidance. Some severance, for example. People receiving Tarp money and then exiting the company as they walk out the door, getting large severance payments. This is what we focused on.
What can you do about that money then?
Not much. Congress didn't give me any authority to try and enforce getting the money back. I will say this, however. 11 of those 17 companies already returned every dime that they borrowed from the taxpayer with interest. I mean, it's, I think, a very good example of the effectiveness of the Tarp program. These companies were saved by the taxpayer. They quickly repaid the taxpayer, a lot quicker, I think, than Congress ever expected when they set up this look-back provision.
You used excessive, you said ill-advised. Why isn't this contrary to the public interest?
At the time the payments were made, they did not violate any statute. Contrary to the public interest came much later. They didn't violate a statute. They didn't violate any regulations. Some were arguably obligated by law. 11 of the companies, as I say, have already repaid. I thought that using that statutory legal term was unfair.
How much of this is looking backwards, the kind of Monday morning quarterbacking?
Oh, there's a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking here. I mean, I was required by law to look back at payments that were made a couple of years ago, at the time, second-guessing what they did, with no enforcement authority, with Congress not expecting that they will have repaid, as 11 companies had. So yes, there's quite a bit of Monday morning quarterbacking here.
And for those remaining, the 6 firms that still are not in repayment but have had these excessive, ill-advised, but not contrary to public interest, what is your solution? What's your prescription for them? My solution,
well, first of all, one of them is Citigroup. They've already been under my jurisdiction in 2009 as one of the 7 companies that I restructured with their help, restructured their entire compensation system. But all 17 companies, whether they repaid or not, I have requested, because that's all I can do is request, that they impose in their own private compensation systems a break provision, which would allow the board of these companies or their compensation committees to terminate legally obligated compensation contracts and declare them null and void going forward in the event of another financial crisis.
And so for those companies that have repaid back their Tarp funds, they're totally in the clear in your book?
No, I've also asked them, even though they're totally in the clear that they don't owe the taxpayer, but I've also asked them as well, all 17 companies, whether they paid back or not, to voluntarily insert this break provision going forward. Frankly, all 419 companies that ever received Tarp money should do the same.
Any of those 11 that have repaid, you mentioned Citi is under your jurisdiction. What of those 11 have put in pay practices that you deem acceptable?
Again, you have to look at each one separately. You've got to examine exactly what they've done. They're out from under my jurisdiction now, and fortunately, that's the way the law is written. But you'd have to examine each of them and reach your own conclusions.
Is Goldman fine, for example? Do you like their...
Again, Goldman's made some important changes. Mr. Blankfein and I have met on a number of occasions. I've urged him to make certain changes. He readily agreed in terms of performance-based criteria, limited base salaries. We'll have to see over the next year or two.
That was Ken Feinberg speaking to our Hans Nichols.